So welcome, Sir Alex. Let me just ask you first, general question. Is Britain, do you think, sufficiently alive to the security and strategic threat posed by China?
Well, look, vigilance is important, but I also want to avoid moral panic here. Let us just light on the central fact here. The principal victims of Chinese espionage are by a country mile the Chinese people. Chinese government spends significantly more on internal security than external security. And disappointingly, it turns out the internet is not necessarily freedom's friend. In this case, it's used for the purposes of social control. So there is no corner of Chinese life that is not visible to the authorities. And that is always going to be, because of the nature of the state, their primary preoccupation. But as China seeks to rejuvenate its, pursues the Chinese dream and reestablish its position as a global player, it's going to increasingly take on a strategic external task, and that will mean that this threat goes up.
So you have then, yeah. I mean, you then do use the word threat. What is the nature of the threat from China then? There are some voices in America, as you'll know, who take the view pretty starkly that militarily, strategically, in business and finance, China should be seen as a hostile power seeking dominion in the world outside China. Is that a fair assessment? Does it match yours?
I think it's a simplification, but we do need to realize and accept that we're in systematic competition. The idea that China would become more like us as it got richer, which sort of underpinned their accession to the World Trading Organization, that was palpably wrong. And Xi Jinping is manifestly intent on a divergent path. Chinese Communist Party don't have the same dogma as the Soviet Union had about exporting revolution. But the reality is, as a totalitarian autocratic regime, it's extremely sensitive to the existence of alternatives and the way in which those can undermine its own legitimacy. So everything about China will ultimately be about its domestic security. But given its heft, its need to reestablish itself, and the fact that they're diverging ideologically, increasingly, yes, it's going to become a threat. I should say, though, that hitherto, and in my experience, from an espionage perspective, their focus has generally been on commercial stuff. It's been the Russians that are focused on political and strategic intelligence. Maybe that is changing.
Yeah. All right, let's just look at the question then of different forms of espionage. Then the balloons, a number of balloons have been shot down by the United States Air Force over the past 48 hours or so. And this morning we're told that the British government, by the Defence Secretary, by other ministers, would be prepared to shoot down Chinese balloons over this country. The Transport Minister said balloons may already have flown across British airspace. Do you, by the way, believe that is the case?
Well, look, we don't know, and this whole thing, to me, takes on the character of a sort of boiling frog, that stuff has been happening, to which neither side has ascribed much significance, frankly, perhaps correctly. But the point being that the political environment has changed radically, particularly in the United States, where there's real political unanimity. Probably the only area of unanimity is around the threat posed by China. And suddenly the stuff takes on a completely different significance. So I do not know the answer to your question. I question whether we would even really have realized. I think probably this isn't just the beginning. But it just looks and feels different in the context of the tensions that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, obviously you caution against getting overexcited about these things, but surely a surveillance balloon above, let us say, sensitive military installations, for example, that surely is an issue, surely is a problem.
Yeah, I'm not seeking to be complacent. As I say, generally, I think we need to understand that we are in a competition. I don't think the answer to that is to put aside all of the tools that we have to try and transcend those differences. But the last thing we want to be is weak or indulge in wishful thinking. So yes, but I think particularly in this instance, we need to look at it in the context of all of the things that states get up to and China can do. I question whether this is particularly significant in the context of all the other collection that will be taking place. It's
Right.
visible. The thing that we have all been focused on for years is the cyber threat, the threat that comes from the sort of internet and other cyber connectivity. That I think is normally underestimated because you can't see it. This is something that's literally visible and therefore seems to attract a completely different reaction.
Okay. So look, within then the confines of a sense of proportion, if a China balloon is seen over Britain, would it be right to shoot it down?
I think I'm really struck by this, John. So when I looked at how President Biden needed to respond to the balloon that flew over the United States, he had absolutely no choice. And my question to you really would be, how would Kennedy have been able to react during the Cuban Missile Crisis if he had faced a 24-hour news cycle? Essentially, he was trapped by the expectations of the political environment and his own population. So I would have thought if one flew over here, our politicians would find themselves in a pretty similar vice. Whether it's sensible to do so or not is another matter. We would, of course, be entirely within our rights if it was within our airspace, and I wouldn't particularly counsel against it.
Okay. I mean, you're not exactly hawkish on this subject. I mean, what would be the argument against shooting down a balloon?
I think that, well, look, I don't want to go there on whether you shoot it down or not. I have other views about how we should respond to this. In fact, traditionally, China has been pretty impervious to embarrassment when it comes to certainly cyber espionage, and people call it out and not a lot changes. At the moment, I think they're a little bit vulnerable, and I think the real thing to do here is to make a big political fuss, as is evidently happening. China, actually, in particular, is positing a thing called the Global Security Initiative, which is his version of the new rules-based order. It's set up in opposition to the sort of American version. It's all about defending the rights of developing countries from interference by the West and America with its overweening capabilities. And it's getting a lot of resonance in the non-aligned world, particularly in the context of the Ukraine war. And this completely lends the light of that. It's actually really quite awkward because it's an absolutely flagrant and blatant infringement of people's sovereignty. And obviously not just the US's. These things are going to be all over, fly over many countries. So now is a really good time just to push home this message in all of the international fora and on the media that this is China not just not living up to international expectations, but not living up to its own rhetoric either.
So embarrassment as a strategic weapon.
It's not a good look. They're presenting themselves to the non-aligned world as guardians of the sovereignty of developing nations, and this just is just a very different message.
Yeah. Now tell me, are you worried about China's penetration into UK society? I'm thinking of, in particular, students on British university campuses, or China's support for programs at British colleges and universities.
Yes, I think that we need to remember that free speech is free speech. It is the thing that's made us strong. It's the thing that is the difference between us and our authoritarian counterparts. And how ironic would it be if we allowed extraterritorial restriction of free speech in our country, quite apart from the sort of covert disinformation possibilities that exist? We need to wise up to all of this stuff. There is an organization called the United Front Work Department, which is an emanation of the Chinese state, that, as I've said, is more about the security of China. It's about clamping down on dissidents overseas, for instance. But it's also increasingly coming into broader influence campaigns. And we shouldn't be naive about this stuff. There's lots that maybe the government can do, but to be honest, the most important thing is us and you educating ourselves to ensure that we are capable of discerning truth from falsehood and intelligent consumers of information.
So defending principles of free speech and so on. But when you say we need to wise up, what does that mean? Should this country limit the way that China supports programs on British university campuses, or allows Chinese students to come into this country and join universities? Some of them, it is said, reporting back to or working for the Chinese state. What should be done in that respect?
So this is very difficult. In my view, is the last people in a Western democracy that should be arbitrating as to what the truth is are the government. It should be a societal effort. We shouldn't be into demonizing anybody, but absolutely, and indeed, there's a set of legislation going through the House of Commons at the moment that seek to give the governments tools to act where they have concerns in this space. So I think there is stuff that we need to do. We should not be complacent. The free sharing of knowledge is a thing that's made our economy and our science strong, but we shouldn't be naive about the uses to which that should be put. There is, though, on the students, I would like to say something, which is that whilst it is undoubtedly true that we introduce vulnerabilities when people from other countries who don't share our values gain access to strategic technologies to our education system, and whilst we should be clear-sighted about that and try to prevent it where we can, then the worst thing we should do is demonize students from another country. When you look at, particularly in the context of Russia, what Putin has done to his own country, the harm he's caused, amongst the most key elements of that is the brain drain, the flight of human capital. And we would be mad, we'd be nuts to get in the way of that. Similarly, many key Chinese academics and scientists want to work because they enjoy being here and they can represent a strategic asset if welcomed. And so, I don't want to be naive about this, but we would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we suddenly decide that anyone who doesn't come from the European Union can't be a student. I think that would be a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, would it be right? There's legislation, I think, going before Parliament presently. Or should this country do more to guard against and prevent foreign interests, potentially adversarial foreign interests, from taking a stake in strategically important parts of the British economy?
Yes, so for me, this is about transparency, but pretty well by definition, whether it comes to buying assets or promulgating information. If the ultimate beneficiary is visible, then we can deal with that. And I believe we should be open and cleave to our reputation as a very open society. Where it is deliberately obscured with the intention of weakening us, that represents a threat and is something we should deal with it. So the National Security Bill, for instance, has provisions relating to that in it, which I would support.
Okay, look, have you changed your view of the threat from Russia at all since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
No, we in the intelligence community are what I like to call the canaries in the coal mine. So there was this idea that history had ended. You may remember it, at the end of the Cold War, we'd won. Liberal democracy was the destination. And it's true that for most people and most of the country, it was possible to separate out geopolitics from economics and all the other aspects of daily life. Now, it's not like that for us. We could see pretty well from the beginning that the ideological tectonics and differences that now dominate our planet, they were there in nascent form, really, for most of my career. We were never under the slightest illusion, frankly.
Do you believe, then, that NATO, the West, including this country, should supply more and more powerful military hardware to Ukraine, including jets? Or should they worry, as some do worry, about Russia escalating to the use of a nuclear device?
Look, John, I do not want to sound cavalier. There is, of course, a non-negligible threat that Russia could escalate, including ultimately through the use of nuclear force. I don't believe that they will, though. The reality is China and India have warned against it. The West have warned of massive retaliation, and it makes, I think, little military sense. And what really would be an error is for us to demonstrate to Putin that we were in some way constrained by these threats and to react to them, as is often the case, particularly, I think, in Europe and specifically Germany. And of course, that is just going to embolden him to issue more and greater threats and make the situation more dangerous. There is no evidence that he's actually physically preparing to deploy these weapons. So it's in the price. It is a risk, but of course, the much greater risk, to my mind, is that this isn't brought to an end with Russia being seen to have failed in Ukraine. And that needs to be our aim. I say in Ukraine. This is not about some civilizational battle with Russia, but that is the settled war aim of the West, and we need to provide the material consistent with that. I think that logic will essentially prevail. We will see, I think, more doubling down on the sort of weapon systems that are being provided now. And I think the Ukrainians have shown a particular genius for using them.
Ukraine is crying out for combat planes, very specifically. Are you saying, because you seem to, that we should be supplying as many combat planes as we can and as quickly as we can?
Well, look, I am saying that in principle, this needs to be finished on our terms, and that we should not allow ourselves to be inhibited by the threats issued by Vladimir Putin. I do respect the technical argument that it would take a long time to get these weapon systems into operation. I'm not an Air Force officer. I can't honestly tell you whether that's a really significant constraint or not. But clearly, we need to be practical about this.
Which is why I said as many as possible, as quickly as possible, and you would agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you would do you believe, though, as an intelligence specialist who's watched Russia up close and reasonably personal, do you think Putin's position is in jeopardy inside Russia, maybe from hardliners in Russia?
I think we talk about that 30th September video he made as the hostage video. You know, he clearly is not completely in control of events, but regrettably, the principal threat to his position is from the hardliners, not from people who object to the war. In principle, and I think when and if he gets moved on, the chances are he'll be replaced by someone who's as difficult to work with, if not more, although it's difficult to imagine. I also think we're slightly asking the wrong question. I personally can't conceive of some kind of classic coup event in Moscow. Putin has been preparing for that for decades and is extraordinarily well protected. The issue for him is actually the periphery. I think that Russia is ultimately now, sadly, a centralized autocracy that asserts power through central authority. And as that is weakened through this disastrous war, you can just see it fraying around the edges. You can see civil wars and insurgencies popping up in what Putin would regard as a sphere of influence. You can see regional party bosses, particularly those who have suffered from the extraordinary uneven conscription campaign, starting to complain in a way that they didn't before. So I'd be inclined to look at the edge rather than the center if I was trying to answer your question.
Okay. Last one. You can speak with relative freedom. Now you're outside Vauxhall Cross, Mi6 towers on the River Thames. How well or badly is our government performing as the guardian of our national security?
I think our country's gone through some difficult times, and an undoubted bright spot is the role that we have played in concerting an international response to probably the key issue that we face, which is Putin's aggression in Eastern Europe. We should be really proud of this. In the gap between 14 and 22, we were one of the very few countries that recognized the peril Ukraine was in, didn't buy this logic of escalation we've been talking about, and voted with our feet. We got in there and we helped make Ukraine a more resilient place. And thank goodness. And now within the alliance system, which we remain at the heart of, we've played a really, I think, a positive role in pulling people together. And given, the difficulties politically and internationally that we're confronted with, I think this is an enormous asset. And clearly my former colleagues and my former service and the intelligence community have played a role in this, but it goes much more broadly than that. So I think this is an area, as I say, we shouldn't be complacent about, but we should be proud of, and we should really strive to sustain.
Alex Younger, good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers.